Pawlenty. I'm the CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable. As was mentioned, we're going to talk today a little bit about convenience versus privacy as the dawn of the fourth industrial revolution continues to unfold. I'd like to just provide as a backdrop to my remarks a little story from some years ago when my two daughters were younger. Our family took a car trip over to Wisconsin. We live in Minnesota. We went over to the Wisconsin Riviera. You know what that is, right? The Wisconsin Dells. It's a big water park. It was a hot day and late in the summer. We drove back to Minneapolis, a long car ride. Mary and I were in the front seat. My wife, our young daughter's in the back. You know how long car rides go with young kids. About an hour into the car ride, they're bored. Pretty soon they're elbowing each other. They're pulling each other's hair. They're throwing juice boxes at each other. And pretty soon the tension's inside the car about matching the temperatures outside. So I pull the car into a gas station. I'm pumping gas into the car, kind of grinding my teeth and mumbling about my difficult and bad behaving children. And this gentleman is pumping gas right next to me at the pump, and our eyes kind of meet at the pump. And I look at him, he looks at me, and he says, "You know, I wish I had two kids." And I thought, oh man, Pawlenty, you jerk. You know, you got these cherubs, these gifts from God. How can you possibly feel burdened by these two wonderful children of mine? And I said, well, I'm sorry, sir, you don't have children? And he said, no, I got 5 kids. I wish I had 2 kids. So I just share that with you as a little story about background and context for this discussion. And again, convenience versus privacy sort of implies a trade-off, doesn't it? You can have one or the other. In an idealized state, we'd like to have both. We'd like to have convenience and privacy. As you know, who are operators and visionaries and others who are interested in these topics, that idealized state does not currently exist. So in the meantime and in the interim, we're going to have to come up with some advances for progress around making sure we make progress towards that idealized state. Now, I'm talking mostly today about what these issues look like through the lens of public policy. So as you know, public policy is a front runner of politics, which is a front runner of culture. And by that, I don't mean ethnic culture or national culture, I mean political culture. And as you know, we have growing influences in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party that have sort of left-leaning libertarian strains on the left within the Democratic Party and sort of right-leaning libertarian strains on the right. And on certain select issues, they kind of come together. One of those issues is privacy. And so the bulk of the debate to date has mostly been around government data privacy. And we've seen that unfold at the state and federal level since the 1990s in the form of laws that require mostly sector-specific companies, namely financial services and healthcare, to disclose each year or so what kind of data they've collected on their customers, what they do with that data, and then give the customers some optionality around what they may or may not be able to do to control further distribution, access, or use of that data. Now, that's a very dated process. It's also a very sector-specific approach or limited approach. And I'll just suggest to you that in the coming years, that discussion and the government's involvement in these issues is going to expand significantly for a variety of reasons. Now, as to the dated nature of the current process, we take your data, we meaning I'm a company, if you're in financial services or healthcare and a few select others, we send you out this obnoxious, hard to read even for lawyers, paperwork each year. There's a kind of rolling debate whether it's opt-in or opt-out. Almost nobody other than privacy activists reads it. We throw it in the trash can. And in the year 2017, I think we can all acknowledge that is probably in need of modernization, streamlining, and something more specific that is going to enhance consumer control in real time, more dynamically, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But also, we have to open up the aperture beyond just a sector-specific discussion. Because whether you're talking about security, whether we're talking about APIs, whether we're talking about aggregators or other aspects of this, obviously, data is well beyond even today limitations around just 2 sectors and privacy and convenience concerns around that. So, you know, from a financial service-centric perspective, We live under a law related called Gramm Bliley that since the 1990s has required certain cybersecurity standards and related laws relating to privacy. We have argued that as it relates to security and ultimately as it relates to privacy, the chain is only as weak as its weakest link, and that these types of constructs, these types of frameworks should be extended to other sectors, because otherwise you don't have the same kind of resiliency in the other sectors that we're connected to, and it begins to impair the entire chain of events. Now, you might imagine if you're in one of those other sectors and somebody says, hey, we have a great idea for you, let's say retailers, we'd like you to have cybersecurity standards, we need them to be more robust and resilient, rigorous, or emerging fintech payment company, those sectors and companies aren't so excited about having those standards visited upon them. So there's a lot of work and consensus building and awareness, both from a policymaker perspective that needs to take place, as well as within those sectors specifically. If you think about this trade-off in a couple of specific examples, we now have, again, the financial service sector, an example being companies that can take a picture of your driver's license and tell you whether you qualify for a home remodeling loan in 1 second. That's incredibly convenient. It's way better than going down to a branch building or branch office somewhere and sitting in a cubicle and having some 25-year-old cross-examine you in public in front of your neighbors about your personal or financial circumstances to see if you qualify for a $20,000 loan to remodel your bathroom. That's cooler just to take a picture of it on your phone and get an answer in 2 or 3 seconds. So highly convenient. But in order for that to work, the amount of data behind that curtain, as you know, is massive. And so as the concerns shift just from government data collection to a broader discussion, as it inevitably will, initially focused on big tech, but soon medium tech, and probably ultimately little tech, around who's actually collecting all this data. Where's it going? What are the rules of the road? What are my privacy rights? Am I willing to trade off privacy and convenience in the interest of getting that kind of transaction done that smoothly, with that little friction? And policymakers are increasingly curious about not just what is the IRS or the NSA connecting, but what is big tech collecting. What are the privacy notices and rights and the like going around? And so data, as you know, is the fuel for machine learning. It is the fuel for artificial intelligence. And additional questions are being raised around, if that data is so darn valuable, maybe we should get paid for it. Maybe it's not just a trade-off between a frictionless transaction and me giving up all of my data rights so that I can have a quick transaction. Maybe if it's so valuable, there should be some other form of compensation involved. Again, I'm not a proponent of all of these ideas. I'm just sharing with you some of the sights and sounds of coming public policy attractions. In addition, people are beginning to talk about the ability of consumers to have dramatically more control over their data. In the current state discussion, probably in the form of cryptographic keys that are in the form of customer control that can be in real time turned on or turned off. As it relates to a particular provider, or maybe as it relates to an entire stream of data. Now, again, I'm not a proponent of all of this necessarily, but if you want to read more about that, there's a guy who wrote Bullseye Breach. His name is Greg Scott. He's an IT veteran, and he's done a lot of work around just kind of figuring out, talking about how cryptographic keys might work, both asymmetric and symmetric, in the wake of the Equifax breach, as an example. And so you can, Google him and learn more about his thoughts on that. But that's sort of directionally where the discussion is headed. We're going to move, first of all, from a sector-specific approach, the historical approach, to something more multi or total sector. We're probably going to move from a discussion of paper and opt-in and opt-out to something more real-time and dynamic and consumer-centric and consumer-controlled. And then we're also going to have to address what happens with data breaches. So as you know, the internet was designed to be open, connected, and wasn't designed as a security-first capability. That was sort of an after-the-fact concern. So security is being bolted on retroactively, and you'd have to say, based on recent experiences, the idea around security has got a lot of challenges left in it. And so we are regularly, if not daily, certainly weekly, and this is the stuff that's known publicly, not to mention all the stuff that's not known publicly, there is just massive, almost endless hacks. Equifax being a great example of it. So in the wake of that, some policy questions arise, which is, do these companies who extract, buy, or exchange value for data, what is their duty to protect it? Again, in the financial service sector, that's spelled out in law at a pretty robust, rigorous, and specific level. But for everybody else, what's the duty? If you get hacked, is it a shoulder shrug? No, I don't think so. Is it an absolute duty to protect the data? So if something goes bad, it's on you, you pay. If you do, does that mean people get to sue you, or does it just mean there's a set fine for it? Does the government set it, or do individuals bring it in litigation? If there's going to be a standard, is the standard a reasonable standard? Reasonableness standard? So this is an issue that is being worked out through the courts. The FTC is going to get involved for non-healthcare, non-financial service sectors, but they have very little background or expertise in mass data commoditization, or what some have dubbed invasive data practices. So they're beginning their exploration of what, if anything further, they should do around those kinds of practices with these kinds of issues in mind. There's also a question around notice. Right now, with the exception of some state laws, there's some ambiguity around how quickly a company needs to notify its customers and other stakeholders once they're breached. And you've seen awful examples of awful behavior in that regard. I won't name names, but there's very high-profile breaches where the company, notwithstanding no particular law enforcement concerns, didn't notify stakeholders or customers, or maybe actively even covered it up for many, many months, probably under a reasonable person standard, inexcusable. And so those issues are going to come rushing to the forefront about once you know you are breached or you have put your customers or stakeholder issues at risk, what's your obligation and within what period of time do you need to report? From a notice standpoint, I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a debate about whether these are government enforcement actions or private lawsuit right of actions or some combination of the two. And then I know we're coming up on time here, but I want to just close a little bit about where this goes even more specifically. So the EU, not necessarily everybody's favorite organization from a public policy standpoint, either there or here, has done a number of things, at least conceptually, that are at least worth paying attention to. Again, you don't have to embrace them ideas, but I think you can accept the fact that they're raising these issues are probably going to now morph to the U.S. in more dramatic form, at least as a discussion point. One of these is the right to be forgotten. What's the ability or the legal right for individuals or entities to have their data erased in whole or in part in a chain of events or within a certain silo of custodial retention of that data? I think you're also going to have a need technologically or otherwise to move away from Social Security numbers, obviously, as an identifier. The Equifax alone, breach, not to mention many others, have so massively exposed Social Security numbers that they're generally available for almost everybody, and so they're no longer really effective as an authenticator. They're really only effective as an identifier. And once that identifier is usurped by a third party, its authentication value erodes and goes out the window. And then I think increasingly you're going to have policymakers and the public shift their attention from, or add to their attention scope, what does the government have? What does the government know? What does the government do to it? And turn those exact same questions to big tech and soon medium tech and little tech. And I think the concerns around privacy may lessen over time, either as a matter of generational perspective or as a matter of a quid pro quo for frictionless, convenient, free, or economical transactions. But I think you and we would be kidding ourselves if you don't think that these issues are coming forward in ways that are going to be very much more pointed in the future than they are now, particularly, and I'll just say this lastly, as the value and effects and impacts of artificial intelligence and machine learning fully set in, and more people become more aware about the value of the data and the data chain of events, and how that has been so ubiquitously gathered and distributed and become available, I think we're going to have a very interesting political and policy discussion about what to do about that. And the entity that's going to address it is going to come in the form of calls for political or governmental action. And again, it's not a today debate necessarily, but I think it's coming in the next 3 to 5 years. It is now 11:16. My time to end was 11:15. I'm going to respect that. There was going to be time for questions, but I think in lieu of the need for a bio break and your break before the 11:30 session starts, I'm going to end there and just say thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and I wish you all well as you go forward in this very exciting and challenging future. Thank you very much.